Okay, good morning everyone. So we're going over the introduction lesson to organic chemistry. It's just a very brief start to talking about a term called a functional group, what a functional group is, and being able to identify them. Okay, so organic chemistry is a very common branch of chemistry. Typically, it's more geared towards the biological side of chemistry. However, there's a lot of applications involved, especially if you're considering going into the chemical engineering field. So things like pharmaceuticals, production of pesticides, various odors and flavors. So something you don't typically think about, but some food chemistry, right? So artificial flavors that are produced to put into products that we purchase are all done through organic chemical reactions. So over the course of the next month or so, we're going to be going over a whole bunch of different types of reactions, ones you may have or may not have heard of before. But again, today is just kind of a little intro to the topic. Okay, so what's considered to be an organic compound to begin with? So typically, something that's organic is a structure that is made up of majority carbon, or I should say a carbon-based structure. Now, that doesn't mean that every single compound that has carbon in it is organic. There are some inorganic species of carbon. So, for example, any oxide, so carbon monoxide, carbon dioxide, carbonates, polyatomics that involve carbons, those are not organic. Organic typically means a carbon-containing molecule that can be derived from a living life form. Now, whether it's a plant or an animal, bacteria, but typically oxides, right, are a gaseous form. Right? It's not from a living thing. You have more abiotic versions of carbon. So those are called actually inorganic structures. So obviously the focus here is we're going to be looking at organic. So meaning things that can be found within a living structure. Okay, so we're going to be talking a lot about functional groups and different types of functional groups, but there are some characteristics that are very commonly seen in any functional group that we look at. So what I mean by functional group is essentially like a group of atoms, or it could be an atom specifically, that essentially will change the properties of a molecule. So it may change the solubility, it may change the melting point, boiling point, surface tension. Some sort of property has been altered because of the fact that that portion of the molecule exists. So some examples can be multiple bonds, so double bonds, triple bonds, alcohols, ethers, carboxylic acids. There's a whole slew of them. Okay, so essentially chapter 1 that we're going to be going through, we're going to be focusing on every single one of the functional groups. I guess not all of them that exist, but the most common ones that we'll be discussing throughout the course of this unit. Okay, so functional groups, as I mentioned, is the whole purpose of them is that they have an impact on the molecule in some sort of physical or chemical property. So by understanding how the functional group works, how it actually causes the change in that molecule's structure, you can start to predict changes to the physical property. So that's why we focus on polarity and intermolecular forces in Unit 1 that we looked at already. It's because when you see these functional groups, you're going to notice there's going to be a change in those forces or change in polarity, and then that's what really has the direct impact. So a functional group is typically considered to be the reactive portion of the molecule. So carbons, like carbon-carbon bonds, are very unreactive, and you're going to see that as we go through the different groups. But as soon as you start seeing different atoms or different elements that change up the polarity, you can start having changes. And as I mentioned, there's a few listed here: solubility, melting, boiling points, and also reactivity. So don't worry so much about the specifics. Once we start looking and focusing on one functional group at a time, we're going to be mentioning how it will change up the structure. Okay, so there's 3 main molecule properties that you're going to be looking at. So a functional group can be a carbon-carbon multiple bond. It can be electronegative elements. So for example, a fluorine, a bromine, a chlorine, right? Like a halogen group, oxygen as well. or you're looking at now double bonds between carbon and oxygen. Okay, so when you're looking at a molecule, if you see any of these things, right, you know that you have functional groups that are present. So carbon-carbon multiple bonds, this should be very straightforward. So a double bond or a triple bond is really the focus here. So if you see a carbon-carbon double bond, we know that that's a functional group. Carbon-carbon triple bond, functional group. Now the reason why those functional groups are important is because it changes the reactivity of that molecule. Double bonds and triple bonds are much more reactive in comparison to single bonds, and that has to do with orbital structure, right? So if you remember, we have sigma bonds and we have pi bonds. So sigma bonds are very strong, okay? So meaning single covalent bonds, right? The overlapping, let's say if I have a 2p overlapping with another 2p. So this overlapping is incredibly strong in comparison to the pi, like relatively, I should say. So remember, a pi bond is not a direct overlap, but it's more so a side-by-side, this should say a side-by-side interaction, right? So this pi bond is much easier to break. So when we look at, well, why are double bonds and triple bonds easier to break? They're more reactive. It's simply because it takes less energy to pull those orbitals apart. Okay, so here's another recap of this. So why are carbon-carbon bonds more reactive if they're double or triple? It has to do with the fact that pi bonds are much weaker in terms of the sharing of those electrons in comparison to a sigma bond. So remember that pi bonds, right? One pi bond exists in a double bond, and if you have a triple bond, you have two pi bonds. But regardless, the sigma bond is the stronger of the two types.